Hello and welcome to the Drum History Podcast. I'm your host, Bart Vanderzee, and today we are joined back on the show by Brandon Green of DRUMMechanics.com. Brandon, welcome back on.
Bart, thanks so much for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be here. I love your show. All the episodes lately have been amazing, so I'm really excited to be back again.
Yeah, the first one was, I believe it was the biomechanics of drumming was kind of the title. That was a great episode. Check it out in the description. I'll link to that on YouTube, and you can listen to it on the podcast platforms, wherever you want. But before we start, it's been a little while, so I want to make sure I remember to do this. I have a brand new upper tier member on Patreon who I want to give a shout out, because if you're in the upper tier, you get a shout out. So his name is Tim Funk. He said he didn't really have anything in particular to shout out. He said he just enjoys the show, and I wanted to give him a mention. So thank you to Tim Funk, or T-Drums, as his email is. And if you guys want to get on Patreon and get a shout out for your band, shop, anything you want, check out patreon.com/drumhistory, and we can get you set up. So anyway, back to you, Brandon. So you have a brand new course that just launched, correct, on drummechanics.com. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Yeah, it literally dropped today as we're recording it. So it's going to be a little bit when this is out. It's called the Drum Ergonomics Blueprint. And honestly, I mean, for anyone that listened to the biomechanics of drumming, the episode we did, probably will recall that 8 to 10 years ago, I wrote for Modern Drummer for several years talking about ergonomics and exercise science and anatomy. And over the years, from those articles and from working with a lot of professional drummers, a lot of recreational drummers, I'm just seeing a lot of consistencies in drum set ergonomics issues and injuries and pain problems that keep popping up that are really consistent. And there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat to help resolve these pain issues so people can play pain-free, essentially. But the most important thing, honestly, is getting the ergonomics right, because there is forced geometry that we have to deal with this beautiful drum set. And if we don't know how to make sure that it works with our anatomy and some very basic physics, injuries, problems, and honestly, lost sonic qualities are all things that are readily available. So the Drum Ergonomics Blueprint is, at the moment, and it might grow, is a 4-hour beast that really goes from everything from understanding the basic physics, some basic anatomical principles, at least the stuff that drummers need to be aware of, and then we build the drum set one item at a time, from drum throne to considering what you need to think about with posture, to adding in the floor instruments and the pedals and the bass drum, and going really through everything. There's one simple idea that's really shared later in the course, but it really is talked about quite a bit, is this idea I call the 80-20 rule. And it's really a cheesy marketing name, but it's the idea that if you look at most drum sets of all genres are pretty much 4-piece and 5-piece drum sets, and everything is kind of set up in a very similar manner. Hi-hat here, ride here, crash here. And if you see anything that's a departure of that, it's really wild. Like you see Stanley Randolph with his ride cymbal where the rack tom traditionally is, and he's going to rack tom over to the right. And it's like, well, that's weird. Yeah. Well, the thing is that if you're a drummer who has any injury history, or you're playing a genre where you're playing an instrument a lot more often than something else, we don't necessarily go crazy with customizing drum sets, but we should triage those instruments to make sure they're readily available. If you're going to be playing a China 80% of the time for your music, it shouldn't be over here in a position where I'm at an end range position of horizontal abduction and I have tension through my shoulder and I spend 40 minutes of a 60-minute set over there, because you're going to have problems. Why not place it somewhere that's in a more comfortable window? And so the idea with 80-20 is, if I do an active range of motion assessment, like I take my arms, I turn out as far as I can move pretty far. I can get out to my arms are pretty much parallel with one another, but it's really tight here. So this is my end motion. I can perform here, but I probably don't want to. So if I turn this in a little bit, when I get about halfway into 45 degrees, that tension decreases and it's pretty comfortable. So why don't I, for my personal, set up all the things I'm going to play 80% of the time in this comfortable window. And then the other stuff, like the crazy Chinas and everything, we place it in extra ranges.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
I mean, honestly, so to me, a lot of it is we set up the drum set because that's how you're supposed to set up a drum set. It looks like this because of the way it's always been. And obviously there's things that make sense. Bass drum here, hi-hat here, snare drum here, toms. But cymbals, it's very much like, it's this way because it works. That's just the way our ancestors have done it before us. But it takes guts sometimes to set something up in a way that's more ergonomic for you. But before we keep going super far into this. I want to kind of rewind and just take this back to the most basic levels. Because if you're watching this, I most likely, what I'm thinking is naming this like Drum Ergonomics 101, the basics. Because I know with people through your course can get the absolute deep dive of everything they need to know. But let's start at the most basic. So someone might be watching this who's new to drums. Literally, can you define what ergonomics is and then go from there? Because I was explaining it to my 5-year-old earlier, and I'm like, oh, I'm doing this interview tonight about ergonomics. And I was like, I described it as it's how you set things up to be most comfortable, but it's like, I feel like there's more to it than that. So can you define ergonomics for us?
I think the best way to explain it, and I explained it to my 5-year-old leaving today too, is ergonomics is really a synonym for efficiency. And
Huh.
so when you think about the workplace that you're in, whether it be an office desk, it's how efficient is this thing? And any layer that provides resistance for you to do whatever it is you're going to do is not efficient. So if I'm sitting in a chair, like I'm sitting in a desk right now, I'm in a computer chair at my desk. If the chair is too low and it's pushing my legs up, which produces some tension or feeling in my back I don't like, this is now adding an element of resistance or opposition to motion, which is inefficient and is not going to be efficient for me to do what I need to do longer. Let's say I'm sitting low and I don't have that problem, but the desk is a little too high. Now I have to reach up higher to use the keyboard, which again is inefficient and adds a layer of opposition, stopping me from using the keyboard easily. So when
Sure.
you think about ergonomics, the best way to think of it is, how do I create the most efficient system possible? And every instrument has its own unique characteristics, while there are a lot of similar characteristics.
That's interesting. And I mean, you obviously see it in like everyday life of like an ergonomic, like bicycle grips can have an ergonomic, like, feel to them, or the
For
design,
better
or
or for
your,
worse.
yeah, for better or for worse, which it's interesting because I think sometimes that term ergonomic could be like, oh, this is good for me. But it seems like ergonomic by definition would be specific to each person. Like you can't really buy an ergonomic thing off the shelf.
Because
Maybe
then
a
it would
mouse.
inherently because then it would inherently not be ergonomic, right? Because if you think about
Okay.
this, right? Because if I go to Dr. Scholl's, and I don't know if you got that in the US, but for
Oh
us we
yeah,
got like
sure.
orthotics, right?
The
If I go
doc.
get
Yeah.
if I go get a generic orthotic, and this is the one that fixes arches, right? Well, I don't know about you, but even if we both have the exact same foot, your big toe might be longer, your arch might be different. Every single person's foot is 1000% different than the person beside them because of geometry, wear, body fat, the amount of skeletal muscle, their weight to strength ratio, all of that stuff. So you go buy an ergonomic orthotic, which I'm not even sure it's a thing, but let's call it a one size fits all orthotic. It's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Anything that's a one size fits all is really not. So you need a custom prescription. So this is like, what's a funny conversation is when you talk about drum thrones that are shaped with grooves in the middle, like tractor style thrones.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Those are extremely comfortable to sit in, but you run into some really interesting, like I can't recommend tractor thrones as a broad recommendation for two reasons. One has to do with the shape. Is that the Mapex one is shaped differently than the DW5000 I have over there. The Pro Roadster one's different. I've been on ones that are full-on motorcycle shapes. What if you've got someone who's got a wider butt versus a narrower butt? It all becomes a real complicated situation. It comes back to what I just said.
Hmm.
Is it actually causing resistance that's making your motion inefficient?
Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well, talking 101 basics
fun.
of ergonomics here. I think what might be helpful for people is let's take a basic 5-piece drum set, not a really fancy throne. I mean, I use the pork pie one. That's the thicker one that a lot of people use, and that's great. But let's not even go that far of cushioning. Let's just say you have a basic. Let's say you have a Pearl export kit that you've been playing for a couple years. What do you do? We can start it with the drum set is taken down, because I feel like sometimes if it's already set up, sometimes you're like, well, let me just move it a little this way, little
Yeah,
this way.
yeah.
Let's start at the basic. Nothing is set up. You just got back from a gig. They're in your car. You're unloading them. How do you best tell people to start with a blank carpet and set the drums up for themselves?
Well, let's say if it's someone's really trying to get started with this, I always recommend you start with your drum throne because sitting inherently is not a fantastic thing. But if we're going to be sitting, we want to
Sure.
try and make sure that we're in the most comfortable position possible. So if we're talking about drum ergonomics 101, the most important thing is making sure that your body has the motions and positions available to do the thing you want to do. So if I want to be seated, most people are able to sit on their drum throne comfortably. That's a pretty normal thing.
Yeah.
However, if you're sitting too low or too high, there can be challenges. So one of the things they teach in the course, which I suppose is not 101, but you'll see why it is 101, is something called an active range of motion assessment. I'll explain this and then we'll just use this going forward.
Okay.
An active range of motion assessment is if I take any limb and I move it in a direction and I come back, there's an amount of motion I have available based off of my strength and my structure. If I reach my arm up, I can't go back any further because my bones, tissue, or right, you get to that point.
You feel it.
There's things you feel, and it's like, is it the bones? Is it the ligaments, the tendons, the nerves, the artery? It could be everything. It could be one thing. So when you get to that end range, that's as far as I can go. The challenge now lies is if I try to go further, my corridor, as I explained to you before in the last one, can only go so far. And so when I'm sitting, as I'm sitting here on my chair now, if I'm sitting and I'm sitting tall, can I lift without shifting my weight, one leg off the ground a little bit without moving? And then can I do the same thing on the other side? Now, I don't know about for you, but in my chair here, I can lift my foot up about 6 inches off the ground on both sides, which means I have enough hip motion to lower my chair by about 6 inches if I wanted to, because that's how much motion I have available if I want to. Now, the sitting higher thing is easier because you're obviously able to stand, but then you get into the other side of the equation, which becomes part of the physics conversation. But on that end, like, does that make sense to you, Bart? Like this motion
but yes, it does. But then, so when you sit down at your throne, what do you want? Do you want to be able to lift your foot 6 inches off, or what is the ultimate goal?
In my opinion, you want to be able to sit on your throne and hover both feet off the ground without shifting your posture, without anything feeling too strained. Okay. So right now, as I'm sitting here, my feet are not on the ground and I'm sitting with my bum right in the middle of the chair with no backrest. My stomach is tight and I'm tall. If I can't do this, then we need to adjust the positioning or the throne to make sure you can.
Gotcha. And there's no like, if you can't do it, lower it. If you can do it, you're good. If you can't, like, there's no, you just experiment with taking it up and down and being able to lift your feet off the ground without feeling like you're like going to get like fall off or get shaky kind of, discomfort.
Correct. So when you do the motion assessments, it basically lets you know what is the window of opportunity I have available. So basically, if you look from sorta 90 degrees up to when you get to about below 45 degrees of your hip, that's kind of like the low to high window for most people. There are outliers, of course, but you want to make sure you can do that, because if you do that, that represents that the majority of your weight is through your bum and not through your feet.
Got it.
And so, I mean, this might be a bit of a jump ahead, but this brings up the idea of like sitting on the middle of the throne versus the edge of the throne. So there's an experiment that I've done a few times on social media, and I've had many pro drummers do it, and it's always really interesting. I'm 185 pounds as I am today, and if I sit in the chair as I am, with the motions I just showed you, and I place one scale underneath each foot, so I got like an analog scale, they're all downstairs, analog scale under each foot, so I've got two scales. Each foot weighs approximately 17 pounds in the orientation where I'm sitting in the middle of my drum throne.
Okay.
So that allows me to lift my legs up. And it means when I lift my legs up, I'm only dealing with the 17 pounds of resistance on both sides, or approximately 35 pounds if you want to do that. So if I shift my weight forward, so I'm sitting on the edge of the drum throne in the exact same scenario, it shifts so there's 35 pounds of weight into each foot. And that's because more of my center of mass, my torso weight, is shifted forward, which means that now I'm dealing with 70 pounds total as opposed to 35.
Wow.
So it's a big
crazy. Yeah.
So when you think about, I'm keeping time with my left hand doing quarter notes or eighth notes, let's go eighth notes a little faster, and I'm trying to do some sort of syncopated kick drum pattern. would you rather be dealing with 17 pounds on each side or 35 pounds? And this is where if you've got way too much resistance, it's inefficient. It creates more fatigue through your body, but also starts the shifting and juggling because you don't have as much stability.
Sure. I never thought about that. I mean, I guess there's times where you do lean forward, but then of course you're leaning forward, all your weight's there. You got, 35-pound heavy feet, and it's like it gets difficult. So scooching back, centering yourself more. My wife did, she hasn't done it in a little bit, but she used to be a Pilates teacher.
Oh yeah, yeah.
All of the centering and all those little movements and how it at first you're like, this isn't making a difference whatsoever. And then you really do it more and you realize, oh yeah, okay, things are centered and important. What do you think about those? Let's just use the example of the pork pie. There's 10 million of them sold, all made by Bill Dedamore in his,
he's incredible,
in his garage or whatever. Like, is having a big cushy throne okay? Or is there a plus, pro or con to that?
It depends on the material for sure. I've never used one of his thrones.
Okay.
But the surface area is really important, like making sure that it is firm and you have a nice flat surface area. From external observation, his thrones look fantastic, but I couldn't really comment without trying them. It's like if I have a memory foam mattress at home, I wouldn't want to drum on something like that. Because that would be, first of all, and I mean, it's going to obviously may sound obvious. When you sit down on it, it's going to compress to where you have the most convex areas. So like if I'm sitting down, my bum cheeks are going to go down deeper. But then if I have an asymmetry, like where I'm leaning to one side, you actually it starts to compress down on the one side a little bit more. And then over time, because you have that now 45% shift, it goes 56, 57%, and it starts to exacerbate it.
Yeah.
But I mean, surface area is the most important thing in my opinion. Like this is where generally I've recommended, depending on someone's size, the DW 5000 and 9000, no affiliations, just they're firm, they're solid. The 5000's a bit smaller, the 9000's larger, very effective.
Well, you look back, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Of course, gear technology used to be so different, but you look back at like the old pictures of like Ringo when he's on basically a piece of like plywood that has a little bit of leather on it. And the rod, I can see it now. It's like flat and then kind of comes down almost like a Z, like the rod that's holding it up. And it's like there is no support. It's barely big enough for his butt to sit on it, and that's how it used to be. So I think obviously things have come a long way. One more throne question, and then we can move on to like adding in your snare and kind of building this drum set. But is there any golden rule of like, I feel like you sit down and sometimes you're like I think we talked about this in the last episode, but like you want your knees to be at 90. You want you don't want your knee to be above your hip or anything like that when setting the height of the throne in relation to the bass drum and all that. Is there any golden rule?
No, and the simplest thing is that everyone's anatomical proportions are completely different. Yep. I mean, I work with one of the guys that I work with here. He's the same height as me, and his legs are significantly longer than mine. So when he sits down, the bass drum is going to always be further away from him than I. His torso is shorter, so that changes everything. There are some application of force kind of rules that are going to be important, like when you strike a drum, just because of when we can think about reaction forces and Newton's law. But if you go, your hip should be at 90 degrees, your knee should be at 90 degrees, that's not true. There are some outliers. Like for example, if you sit around 45 degrees, right? There's this kind of, so in mechanics, there's something called component forces. And it's like the combination of rotary forces and compressive forces is a good way to think of it. So like if I've got my sticks here and I've got another stick here, right?
Yeah,
if I had a
90 degrees for people listening in the car or whatever.
Sorry, I had a 90 degree angle, right? If I take the one that's at a 90 degree angle and I tried to move the bottom stick, right? It's obviously at the most efficient angle, which is 90 degree. It's called a tangential angle. And if I start to move it this way towards the stick a little bit away from 90 degrees to like 75 degrees, it's still pretty good at rotating it. But now I've lost 15 degrees. And some of that 15 degrees that I've lost is actually taking the bottom stick and pulling it into the fulcrum or joint axis. And if I keep coming down to here where the sticks are parallel, it's actually just driving the joint axis or fulcrum into it more and would never rotate, which we've seen that before with bad teeter-totters. So if I get to this place here where I'm at a 45-degree angle, I have a combination of an equal amount of rotational force and compressive force.
Yeah.
So if I go to 45 degrees on the drum throne, right, I have an equal amount of the throne trying to pull me forward as well as me sitting on the edge. So like if I'm sitting in the middle with my legs at 90 degrees now, it's all good. As I start to come up and up and up around that 45-degree window, more of my weight starts to shift to my feet and it starts to tilt on the throne a little bit. And
forward,
it actually,
because you're moving up. This is your butt. You're moving up. Your foot is getting. Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah, and so if I keep tilting so far and the drum throne is flat, right? There's actually a point where the throne is actually in the way. So now I'm forced to move my bum forward to get my bum right on the edge and get my legs out of the way because I can't go any further because there's a teeter-totter effect that starts to occur.
And then you got your 35-pound foot. You got 70 pounds of feet because you're leaning forward on the.
You got it, man.
The throne.
So generally, I mean, so there's not a golden rule, but I generally recommend drummers sit somewhere between above 45 degrees and 90 degrees. And there seems to be a nice-ish window between like around 70 to 80 degrees, in my opinion. But you have all those options available to you.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's move forward here. So again, visualizing our drum set, we've brought our throne in. We got our rug down. We brought our throne in. What would you set up next, and how would you because again, really, I think that raises the question of my immediate thought is bring in the bass drum next.
Yep, bring in the pedals.
The snare. Okay, bass drum. Yeah,
I think pedals are absolutely next. It's hard to not bring in the pedals without the snare drum because it's not really about the snare drum angle, but you have to make sure you're dealing with the geometry in between your knees because you can't really come narrower than 15 or 16 inches. But what I would suggest you do, and so if anyone's interested, by the way, please go to drummechanics.com and there's a free drum ergonomics course that's like an intro that actually goes through all of this. So anyone wants to check it out, you can just go to drummechanics.com and put your email in and we'll send you the free course so you can check it out. But sit down, and what you do is once your feet are on the outside of the snare drum, honestly try to slide your feet out to see how wide you can go and then bring your feet back in. If you remember, Marco Miniman had a DVD, The Interdependence and Independence of Drumming. And he had he was one of the first guys to have 4 or 5 pedals on the one side. But he was doing the doubles. So he was and his leg was going out. And his leg was completely reached out all the way. So what you want to try and do is feet down. You want to figure out where the pedals can go. You want to try and widen your knees as much as you can to see how wide you can go and how narrow you can go. Coming back to where does it feel comfortable? This one's a little bit easier because if you figured out your drum throne height, you'll already be in a pretty good spot to figure out where that can go. For this, I do recommend that the tibia, if possible, your lower leg, is around at a 90-degree angle to the ground. It's just going to be more efficient and keep it closer to you, but you can reach out a little bit further. It just as your legs get longer, coming back to that thing we were talking about before, as I'm holding up 2 sticks here. If my tibia is parallel to the ground, makes my whole lever from up here to not that far. If I start to bend that out, it makes the whole leg longer, which actually could make it heavier because you kind of get a golf club effect happening.
Sure. I mean, is it just to look at it kind of in an easy way? Is it if I'm sitting down here and I kind of just naturally sit down, maybe it's just because I've been drumming for so long. It's kind of like riding a horse where you start to your legs start to automatically go to that position. But I feel like I sit down and then I kind of feel like I'm in that zone of all right, my, even with my kind of foot angled out a little bit of where I naturally sit feels right, as opposed to being too wide or too tight one way or another. But I feel like your body kind of tells you that a little bit, how far to spread your hi-hat. Plus, your hi-hat's an easy thing to kind of move. It's on its own. So if you're setting up your, I know we were on the bass drum, but if you're setting up your hi-hat too, I feel like you can scooch it, and that scooch is on you. So you might have to, if you're playing a gig and it's sliding, you might have to adjust on the fly.
Well, in my opinion, the hi-hat's actually one of the most interesting instruments of all because of all of them, it's kind of complicated because we use it very often, right? We use it with 3 limbs pretty consistently, the left foot and both hands. Yep. And we want to also make sure that we're not modifying our position too much. So we're kind of jumping ahead there because we got one more thing to talk about first. But let's say for now, the pedals are in a decent position.
Okay.
When you get to the snare drum, and this rule starts to apply for all the drums, it's actually really quite simple. If I come back to, well, and I'm holding up a practice pad here. If I come back to what I was speaking to you about before with those angles, right? If I'm holding a drumstick, I think it makes sense if we ignore anatomy for a moment, which we're not really going to do. It makes sense that we're not going to play the drums with me just stabbing it because it's not efficient. And if I'm at a 40,
Lars style,
yeah, just right. We want to make sure that when I strike the drum, the acorn of the stick or the tip of the stick is striking it at a 90-degree angle. And we've seen many drummers just do this instinctively because this is where you get the natural bounce back pretty efficiently. Yeah. If I'm playing up here and I try and do the same thing, the bounce doesn't work because my body gets in the way. So this actually allows the stick to come back a lot further and almost fly right out of my hand. So when we're striking any percussive drum instrument, I guess they're all percussive, but when we're striking any sort of acoustic drum, not cymbal, we need to be striking it at a 90-degree angle, and anything else is inefficient for the kinetic energy of the stick. And even when you do a rim shot, it's the same kind of idea. We want to make sure we're striking it at a 90-degree angle, but it's not working with a practice pad, but allowing the stick to absorb the majority of that energy. When you get to cymbals, it's a little different because if we want to try and use the ride, we're using actually riding the ride, if you will. We want to do the same thing with the 90-degree angle. When you want to crash a cymbal, you don't want to strike it at a 90-degree angle. What you really want to do is actually strike it on the edge at a 45-degree angle. And this allows that kinetic energy to transfer through the cymbal and come back. So when we're striking any of the drums, we're going to have some anatomy we have to play with, but we're really only going to be considering two angles there. Either am I striking this thing at a 90-degree angle, or am I striking this thing at a 90-degree angle and a 45-degree angle? So all the drums are 90, but with some cymbals, we're not going to be just doing one. We might need to do all of them. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, we're jumping around here a little bit, but it makes you think of like the way you angle your toms, which, thinking of the 80s where everything was like very tilted forward, then going to like, 2000s, everything became perfectly flat, where it's like, so explain that a little further then, because the snare drum, obviously you want it to be at a 90-degree angle when you hit, but I mean, you need to adjust a little bit for comfort of hitting it. I mean, it's tough to have a flat tom and not be hitting the rim when you're going around. I mean,
so I want to be clear, striking the drum at a 90-degree angle doesn't mean that the drums are all parallel to the ground.
Oh,
I think, okay. And I think that that's happened a few times where I've talked about this and people go, well, the drum shouldn't be flat. I'm definitely not saying that.
Okay, so good. I'm glad I can ask the question that other people might be thinking.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. So with the snare drum, I mean, so one, you want to make sure that the tip of the stick, and this gets into the toms a little bit, so we'll come back to that. But when you strike the snare drum, you want to make sure that you're striking a 90-degree angle, and that's going to allow a tangential angle to the surface of the drum. So actually, just to clarify that, if I have the drum at a 45-degree angle to the ground, I'm still going to make sure that the stick is striking the drum at a 90-degree angle to the surface.
Okay.
So this is different than when it's down here.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the difference between a rack tom and a snare drum. Like my snare drum may be flat, but if I have a rack tom at, call it 25 degrees, now I'm still, when I reach up, still trying to strike it at the same angle.
The angle of your hand tilts to modify the stick angles to modify where you're hitting, basically, or how you're hitting.
So if I'm holding, so this is the direction of the stick I'm holding right now is just to represent the application of force. So when I strike the drum, this is a 90-degree angle to the surface of the drum. If I were doing a Terry Bozzio kind of style thing, I want to be, like Mike Mangini rocket toms, right? Those things.
Yeah.
You watch him, they're up in the air and he's striking them at a 90-degree angle.
Yes.
Which is this.
Gotcha.
And so if I've got the 25-degree angle rack tom, which is what mine are right now, I'm making sure that the force application is in this direction. Does that make sense?
Got it. Yes, it does. The wrong thing to do would be to play it like the wrong angle would be you would just lose force, correct? I mean, you wouldn't get as much
two
bounce
things.
Back. Yeah.
So there's so the efficiency of the drumstick is lost because the stick can't use the kinetic energy to bounce back efficiently, because as soon as you start, as I told you before, we change that angle. Some of that energy is actually just going into smooshing into the drum, not the bounce. The second part is when we're thinking about that 90-degree angle, it has to do with the position of your anatomy and your wrist. So if I strike the drum, I want to make sure that my wrist is straight as possible, because if I strike the drum, let me do this a little better for the camera here. And if you guys can, go watch this on YouTube, because it's going to look way better. So if I strike the drum, I want to make sure my wrist is actually not my shoulder, but I want to make sure that my wrist is in line with the drumstick. Because if I have the drum up like a Lars Ulrich thing and I'm striking the drum like this, like the car door analogy, my wrist can't go too much further. So if I'm striking the drum at this angle, that means that the kinetic energy of the stick might be perfect. But whatever energy from the stick that transfers into my hand is actually going into my wrist. And I don't have that wrist motion to absorb that motion. So does that make sense?
It does, and it makes me think of, you have a line on your website that I read while we were getting ready that says, struggling with pain and fatigue, your setup might be to blame. And it's like, if you're set up wrong and you're feeling pain in your wrists, your knees, your back, your ankles, whatever, I feel like this could really make a big difference for some people, you know, to fix their setup.
So yeah, and that's exactly why I've tried to share all this, is because it's just efficient delivery method. So when we think about the snare drum thing, the reason why I brought up the hi-hat earlier is because besides the drum throne, I find the hi-hat is an area that people really struggle with how their body feels. Like they're having neck and tension issues, and it's a difficult instrument because we need to concurrently have our left foot, left hand, and right hand to be able to play this thing. And if we're trying to adhere to all of these rules, like this basic rule of like, I want to make sure the foot was the easy part, but I want to make sure that both my hands will be able to strike the surfaces I want to play at 90 degrees, and I'm not operating from too extreme of a position. Well, if the hi-hat's too far away, like if I can't just internally rotate my arm and strike the hi-hat, it's too far away in my opinion, because then I have to do this. And when I reach my arm forward, this is protracting my shoulder blade, which is a normal anatomical position, nothing bad with it. But when I reach forward, now I have to engage upper back muscles and trap muscles and many other shoulder muscles to hold my arm in this position.
Yeah.
And you can see it with dudes who are playing enormous double bass drum sets. I don't mean 2 kick drums alone, but the guys who have the wide kick drums and the hi-hat pedal's not even attached, you see them and they're playing reaching full across.
Yeah.
Some people get away with it, but it is so much extra muscular demand there. So, you know, a basic rule is if you can't turn your arm in with your right hand and strike your hi-hat without, you just be able to close your eyes and hit what you want to hit, that's not going to be good. We need to move that in a place where it's okay. And the nice thing is there's so many options now because, you know, when you and I first started, 14-inch hi-hats and maybe 13-inch were the only 2 that existed. But now you can get, 22-inch hi-hats. You can get any size. So say your foot is perfect, but you're trying to get the hi-hat closer to you. Instead of moving your entire pedal setup, you could literally, if you wanted to, switch to 16-inch hi-hats, which moves the edge an inch closer, and to play 16.5-inch long sticks. And now you get 1.5 inches more closeness. You don't have to work very hard.
That's interesting, using the gear to bring it closer to you. But so that's kind of, I guess you would say, on the x-axis. Now, what about, let's kill 2 birds with 1 stone here and talk about height. So snare drum and hi-hat, maybe you can do them separately, but then how the relation of each of them, the height of your hi-hat and how high your hi-hat should be, because I think they do play with each other. And then you've got your Travis Barkers who have the hi-hat way up there. And it's like, that's an extreme, but yeah.
Yeah. So the height of the snare drum, we're trying to figure out a couple things. Where can I have the snare drum where my wrists are straight when I strike it and I'm striking the drum at 90 degrees? The other side of it too, with the snare drum specifically, is I want to make sure, I have been suggesting as a general rule of thumb that people have their elbows at 90 degrees. Now, like I told you before, there isn't a golden rule, but the reason why is if my elbows are not at 90 degrees, my wrists have to change position. And so like I have to strike the drum down, or if my wrists are too low, I have to strike my wrists are up more. So I want to make sure my elbow and my elbow's at 90 degrees so my wrists can be straight. And that kind of ends up determining where the snare drum is going to be. So for most people, it's in a very similar height once you start getting into this ecosystem. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're comfortable and it's not too far back. Like another big mistake people do is they put it too close to them and their elbows end up behind them, which ends up putting a lot of extra work across their back. So I don't have a number for you per se.
No, but like a cheat code of like, get it at this point, and if it should be above your knees or next to your this or 1 inch, 2 inches above your, I guess so the answer really to all this is any little tips and tricks like that probably aren't actually what you should be doing, but
no. Yeah.
Getting it at 90 degree angles seem like your friend in a lot of this.
So this is where I've been really working hard in the course to try and simplify the anatomy and physics, because as you're hearing me, it's like, well, where should I put it? So I can tell you, like I have something we give in the course called the Ergonomics checklist, and it's just a system to help you write down your measurements. And once you get it, like write down you get a measuring tape and write this down, and all these different things. So my snare drum, if anyone's interested, the edge for me is 27 inches high, but that's not something that anyone else should do. It just works for me in my proportions. But we have to juggle these two things, like the physics stuff, the 90 degrees as far as hitting a drum, that's not going away, right? The anatomy stuff, we could debate that, but all the suggestions I'm making are what are the most risk averse. It is higher likelihood you're going to injure your wrist at an extreme of position than neutral. So let's hang out where it's neutral, and then everything else starts to fall into place. So I hope that is a suffice answer.
Yes, work smart, not hard, basically in drum world. But all right, then what about hi-hat height?
Yeah. So great question. So similar conversation. In the interaction between the hi-hat and snare drum is my least favorite. Like I really if both my kids get into playing drums, I will teach them how to play open-handed, because it just seems, when you think about the mechanics of it, and then I'll come back and give you an answer, having your arm crossed over your arm for 80% of your playing seems bonkers to me. Like it just literally does not make sense. Like everything is in the way, and then we have to do all these creative stuff to do, like, okay, cool, great. Open-handed playing is, like, from an ergonomic perspective, we get away from right to left-handedness, way more efficient. But forget that. That is my opinion for sure.
Yeah.
If we come back to the hi-hat situation, we do need a couple things, right? We need to make sure that we're striking the hi-hat with the same rules at 90 degrees, so to speak. And if you're playing more of the top of the hi-hat or the edge of the hi-hat, that will vary from drummer to drummer. It could be, so like someone who's a rock drummer may have the hi-hat a little bit higher because they're playing the edge more versus the top, whatever that may be. You also need, of course, some distance in between the two hands so the left hand can do whatever it is that you need to do. I don't actually even know. I think the distance of mine is about 7 or 8 inches. That just ends up being that way.
Yeah, that sounds about right for a general feel,
Yeah. So I think the easiest thing that one person can do is you come back to the hi-hat assessment I talked about, just one of them. There's several actually, and see, can you strike the hi-hat there? And then the next thing you should do is just place your hi-hat, your stick on the hi-hat. Don't even move it. And then with your hand underneath it, just try and play some basic rudiments, like the one side of, like, can you play a double underneath that stick and not have it be in the way and move it around? And if it feels comfortable, then that's great. But what's interesting is if you don't get these heights correct for you, this is where you start to see people shrugging up and doing some really interesting things to, like, the boop boop ga 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 ga. They shrug up the shoulder and get their hi-hat arm out of the way.
Yeah. I mean, really not hitting the stick. I think we've all sat down on someone else's drum set and their hi-hat's low and you're hitting it and it's like, and someone's watching and you're like, I don't actually sound like this. It's the drum set.
Yeah.
But
100%.
That makes perfect sense. Again, I feel like a lot of what we're getting at is like, it's very natural. It should be, you should take the time to do this and set it up where your body will kind of tell you. But really, when we set up our drum sets, a lot of times it's like you set it all up and then adjust.
Yeah.
So I think this is a cool way, because what we're doing now, dissecting it piece by piece, you could do every time you set up your drum set. It doesn't take that long. I mean,
no, and we've been talking for a while about this, and I'm sure there's a lot of information and words I'm saying that it's new words, but I don't think that it shouldn't take a long time to figure this out. Like, I share this information so people can learn, but once you learn a few of these assessments, the principles, like, I love principle-based learning, because if you learn a principle, you can apply it in many different contexts. If you know the angles of force we're talking about, interaction forces, reaction forces rather, and we talk about your anatomy and where things you can hit are good and where you should avoid hitting, then you can figure out a lot of things. But many drummers just instinctively set up their drum set, and you can see it. Some people, if you're a good drummer, you end up in a lot of these positions from playing. But then there are also some areas where it's like people got their ride in a really crazy position and they just been doing it like that for 20 years. Yeah. And I got many drummers. I'm like, hey, listen, like, I know you've been doing this for a long time. Let's change that angle and try this. And they're like, I wish I did this 20 years ago. There's some guy I'm working with right now, like a touring, very popular, wants to maintain anonymity kind of guy, which is cool. And he's a big rocker. And I gave him this 80-20 rule, and we gave him some specific changes, and his whole drum set changed and he's now playing pain-free and more comfortably. And you can see a difference between his videos from 3 years ago to now. Like, it's just ginormous difference. So, and it's just it's because so many drummers get good by just playing with the thing that they've always played since they were a kid and never rethinking it.
Yeah. Now, we'll move on to the toms and the cymbals here and get the, because again, if someone's like doing this in real time and setting their drum set up, that would be awesome. But the question is if you apply these, do you think, obviously the biggest benefit would be that your body would feel better? If you're in pain, you would maybe be in less pain, hopefully no pain. If you are starting out or younger, not in pain at all, you're doing preventative maintenance and stopping that from happening. But do you also think that there would be a benefit to your playing from practicing more of these ergonomic, putting more of these principles into play? Like, would your performing actually get better?
1000%, because the instruments are just going to work with your body better. I mean, the reason why I'm sharing this is that it will prevent drummers from getting injured. One, if you're a young drummer, it's going to make it just all easier. Like, everything just feels smoother, right? If you're an injured drummer, you brought that up. That's a big point, right? Because if someone does any of these active range of motion assessments, that's why I teach the active range of motion assessments. Because I told you that leg lifting thing. Well, suppose you injure your hip, but not that bad, but just enough that it's annoying. And you're sitting in the chair as you are now, you're trying to lift your leg and you're like, fiddlesticks, and it hurts. But then you sit up a little higher and you can lift your leg up and there's no pain to a certain position. Well, now you can go, okay, you know what? Normally I sit at 80-degree depth in my hip, but my hip's hurting right now. So I'm going to raise my drum throne up so I'm sitting at 70 degrees. And now I stay away from that pain spot and I can keep playing the drums. And that's what I do.
And you can heal at that point because you're not
perturbing. You're not rattling. Perturbing is a word, but you're not irritating that pain spot a little bit. And this is what we do in my business. Like, right downstairs, as many people recall, I'm over top of my gym right now, which literally all I do is I work with people who are in pain and we create exercises to help support their body, which is what I'm doing with this course. But understanding the active range of motion assessment is critical because it literally is a check engine light of, do not go here. This hurts. This area does not hurt. Let's keep working with it. And then to your point, it makes playing easier. I mean, truthfully, if you have all these angles correct, like this, most of our body moves in a rotary fashion, right? So if I want to strike the drums, if I have my rack, like if I've got 3 rack toms right now and I have 8-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch in a straight line and then a 16-inch down, right? That geometrically makes sense, but it's not efficient. It's not going to, like, I have to go 1, 2, 3 down to do a tom roll. Do-do-do-do-do-boo. Right? But if you look at the Mike Mangini style setup or someone or mine, if you will, where everything rolls together in that rotary fashion, you can play better because if you're doing a tom roll, you literally don't have to do anything weird. It's just literally you turn your body and you end up on the floor tom. So it absolutely influences your playing from that perspective. And then also just the technique wise, like whatever your technique is, if you get these angles right, you don't have to work. Like, I'm not trying to just do this you don't have to work hard because the drums actually help you continue to sustain whatever your technique is, if it's push pull or French grip or whatever it is. So it absolutely helps. It helps the drum set work with you.
Yes. I feel like a lot of this makes me think of, like, I think Mike Johnston has talked about many things like this, and just once you understand the concepts that you're talking about, you can get better faster because it's easier because you're not fighting against the drum set. And I am very guilty of all of these things, like most people, where you just get used to what you're doing, you sit down and play and you don't really think about it. But we are learning, and that is the start to improving and getting better at these things. So all right, toms. I think toms are, everyone's different, man. I mean, it's fun. I will say, I think it's fun to, like, you're on your drum set at home, you're used to it. You sit on your buddy's drum set and he does the flat tom thing, or they do the angled tom thing. And you're like, man, this is really cool to play on this. But would I do it every day? I don't know. It's fun to try different things, but everyone has a different taste of the tom angle. What would you say is the correct way? What's good, what's bad, what shouldn't people do, pros and cons of different things?
So if you go to the extremes, if we go extremes first, if you go a flat rack tom, I think it's extremely inefficient from a few different perspectives. If you have the Travis Barker era flat rack tom, where it is parallel to his snare drum, you have to reach pretty far forward to hit the middle of the drum. Like you have to reach much further. If it's not parallel with the snare drum, and let's say it's at a regular height, like say you have a 7x12 and it's sitting 7 inches up higher than the snare drum, you cannot just reach your arm forward, hit the middle of the drum. You actually have to reach your arm up and over to hit the middle of the drum, or you're hitting the rim. So if you're trying to play at the rim, that's totally fine. So both, when it's a flat drum, you have to either reach further forward to hit the middle of the drum or reach up and over the rim. Now, every time I bring this up, I'm always inundated with many drummers who play flat drums and they do great. And truthfully, most drummers are incredible athletes and you will figure it out one way or another. But if if I'm being unbiased about it, it is less efficient to have to reach further or to have the material rim of the drum in the way. And you see, like I don't want to name any, but there are many incredible drummers of flat drums and you see them, they snare drum and then they have to reach up and over to hit and like the drum kit looks cool, but that's less efficient.
I was going to say though, I'm thinking of like some Orange County drum set, or OCDP drum set with a vented snare and flat A customs, and it's in blue sparkle, and it's 2005, and the singer's wearing like eyeliner, and the drum set looks cool. You know what I mean? Like that is a vibe for sure.
And I talked to Steve-O of old Sum 41 quite a bit. Yep. And we just were talking about, we're looking at some old photos of his old drum sets to now. And if you look at his drum sets now, I mean, he hasn't taken my course, but we talk about his drum set both of his drum sets are designed very similar how I would suggest people do it. But you look at his old ones, he's got the flat ride, he's got the flat rack tom, and all that caused him problems. He would tell you that himself because he was just doing what all the other guys did. He was one of the guys.
Yeah, he was one of the guys. Which influences a generation of drummers to do it. And maybe that's some back pain now or shoulder pain, you know?
So if you go rack tom, and you have I should be going this way from the microphone. Anyone watching? I've been doing this wrong the whole time.
That's all right.
So if you have a flat rack tom, like you see some people and they got the rack toms like right up in their face, right? That again is fine. You're not going to have the rim issue, but then you run into the wrist issue, which you can see. I mean, you look at old Phil Collins pictures and things like that. You can see he's got the rack toms pretty high up and his wrist is cocked back like I am. So when he strikes the drum, there is not much extra motion to generate kinetic energy to hit the stick or really to go anywhere because he can't go much further and his wrist is at a higher likelihood of having an issue. So the angle continuum can vary with this. I've assessed my angles. My rack toms, the 3 that I have, vary from 22 to 24 degree angle. It's not that's a magical angle panacea by any means, but when it's angled, the rim gets out of the way. And when it's angled, you can actually move the drum a little bit closer to you. Because if I hold this out, like say this is I think it's a 13-inch pad. If I have a 13-inch pad in this orientation and I tilt it this way, well, now towards me, it's only an inch thick and this is 13. So if I tilt it this way, now I've actually decreased the distance of the drum to being about 7 inches. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. Because you're moving the center point closer to you.
Yeah. Basically. So I don't have to, exactly. So I don't have to reach as far. So for me, a 22 degree angle just works fine. I'm not saying it's the perfect angle, but you have some options here. Again, it comes back to the drum throne thing. The goal is to know the extremes of what you should avoid and honestly figure out in between what works best for you. This one's a little more simple than the other ones.
No. And I mean, honestly, I feel like you are very knowledgeable with judging angles and things with your drums because you mess with this all the time. But I was honestly sitting there thinking like, man, I think mine's probably about 20 degrees. Like if I have it at 0, I'm like, that's probably 20. And that feels natural. So I'm pretty sure, you know, that's probably where most people fall. Again, we just did the whole Gear of Nico McBrain episode, and he's got a unique setup that's more like this and that. And yeah.
I don't know if you saw my Instagram picture, but on your iPhone, there's the Measure app.
Oh, I use that. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you use it, put it on your drum. You can find out. Like you just place it on the drum and I'm like, okay, well, this is now 15 degrees and there's the orientation. It's great, man. I love it. I showed in the course. It's amongst a few different hacks, but it's super simple. You just put it on your drums. You're like, oh, my snare drum's 5 degrees and my rack toms are 22. And yeah.
Nice. And that's a pro tip right there because the benefit is then because if it's comfortable, you can repeat it exactly next time and be set up and not be, you know, again, it's next level. I don't want to say nerd stuff, but if you're really setting up your drums the right way each time and you want it to be exact and you're measuring things, knowing the angle is important.
100%, man. 100%.
Yeah. Okay. Tom. So we got we're getting pretty close to being set up on our Pearl Export kit on our nice rug. Floor tom. Floor tom is interesting. I mean, how do you go about getting that? I mean, is it? I usually set mine up kind of level with the snare with a little bit of an angle in, maybe 13 and a half degrees. I don't know, just guessing. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
But yeah, how do you go about that?
So honestly, I think following the level of your snare drum is not a bad place to start. I think having a slight angle is totally fine as well. As far as the angle thing, falling back on the level, if I take my arm and I externally rotate it to where the floor tom would be, I want to make sure that the angle is in line with the orientation of the stick. Like, you don't want it to be angled inward or back. That's a pretty simple one. I think the biggest thing that one of the simplest things that people do with floor toms is they put the floor tom right up against the bass drum. And that's a bad idea. Like, that's a lot of extra work, because if I take my drumstick and I rotate it out as I am now, the actual tip of the stick gets closer to me out here because it's going through this circle, if you will.
Yeah.
So the floor tom should end up, the best thing someone can do, super simple, and there's way more to this, as you can imagine, everyone. Elbow at your side, similar hi-hat rule where you internally rotate, but externally rotate to where you want your floor tom to be, and try and make sure that when your stick goes down, that you're hitting the middle of your floor tom. So when you do a bar, your arm is right beside your body, and you just turn out and you let the stick go down, and you'd be hitting the middle of the drum.
Okay.
So super simple. And then unfortunately with the left arm, that's not going to be feasible. You're always going to have to reach to hit that left floor tom. Sorry, the right floor tom rather. You're always going to have to reach, which is something I told you I don't want you to do with the hi-hat. We come back to the 80-20 rule. How many drummers have their left hand on the right floor tom for a long period of time? Not that many. So you're okay to have that there. If someone is a floor tom rider, like someone who's going to be playing the floor toms a long time, this is where I think, and I love this, a left side floor tom is a great idea, because then that way you can do that and you don't have to worry about doing any of the extra work.
Yeah, gotcha.
Eloy Casagrande does this.
Yes.
Art Cruz does this now. You see more left side floor toms. I think Steve Smith maybe even. And it's great because you can do, I think Eloy, when he was playing with Sepultura, was a great example, because you'd see him doing all this very intense 2 floor tom thing and almost never cross over to hit that floor tom except for a fill. And it just meant that he get to stay in a much better position. Anyway.
Yeah.
Externally rotating your arm, placing the middle of your stick right in the middle of the drum. Pretty easy way to go. A lot of the same rules as the snare drum.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right. Well, then cymbals. What do you do there? There's obviously multiple cymbals. You mentioned with the China. So you already kind of talked about that, about not, if you're playing it a lot, not having it be, ripping. You can feel it in your muscles getting pulled too far in each direction. But let's say you have a standard setup of a crash, like a 16-inch crash, an 18-inch crash, 22-inch ride, hi-hats. Maybe you throw a splash in there. How do you go about setting that up?
So you have the triage, which instruments you're playing the most, for sure. So I would say with the ride, probably in most cases, the ride cymbal is a really popular instrument. Not everyone uses it. Like, you look at a Chris Turner in that genre, no ride cymbal whatsoever. There's a lot of guys in that world that doesn't. So, but if you're someone who uses the ride cymbal, we got to figure out where you want to place it. I think you have 2 options. Everyone plays it in that similar right-hand spot. I think the right-hand spot that most people place it, just out about 22 degrees from their body, is a great spot. But I think you could also place it over the hi-hat just fine, because if you're already playing the hi-hat, you just have to, if you're doing this well, JP Bouvet does this really well, and Mark Juliana has the left cymbal being a ride cymbal. You can absolutely place it there if you want. The only thing with the ride cymbal, it comes back to the angle question. Are you someone that's going to frequently be playing the edge of the cymbal, crashing on it, and the bell? Because if you're going to be doing all 3 of those things a lot, we want to try to make sure that maybe there's a moderate angle, like maybe 45 degrees, so that 22-inch cymbal becomes a little less wide, if you will. The bell gets closer to us. We can crash at a 45-degree angle on the edge of the cymbal, and we can also ride at a 90-degree angle in the middle on the actual body of the ride cymbal as well. But if you're someone who's Travis Barker, you're not playing the bell very often, you're just crashing on it, you could absolutely have a parallel pie in the sky, if you will, but you're recognizing that it's just for crashing on rather than playing any of the other qualities often, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it depends on your style, your preference of ride, crash, bell for your setup. I mean, I usually have it, you're sort of over the floor tom a little bit if you're on, well, I mean, I usually play a 4-piece setup, so it's kind of comes in that in between that where the second tom would be area, and that works out pretty comfortably.
Everyone does it, right? That's coming back to the very beginning conversation.
Yeah.
I had a blues gig that I did recently, and I've been working on a lot of open-handed stuff. And the kit I played was just 2 floor toms, left and right floor tom, kick, snare. And then I had the ride cymbal dead center. And it felt amazing. Like I didn't have any rack toms, and it felt great because I could easily do things with 2 hands, and I had it right in front of me the whole time. And I was off side stage a little bit, so that way I could look off to the left and see everybody. It felt amazing, and it was atypical. Yeah. But it was, as coming back to what I was saying, I was playing that the majority of the set. I didn't have to have my arm out the whole time. I could do the right hand and I can do the left hand. So I encourage people who are listening to this to experiment with setups to see what feels more comfortable. But you said preference. Preference is important, but I want to emphasize a lot of the things I'm suggesting here are actually coming back to frequency. What are you playing the most often? Like for me, my ride cymbal is a little bit further away because I got the 3 rack toms right now. I'm not playing the bell a lot. So when I play the bell, I do have to reach a little bit more. I'm strong enough and I have the ability to tolerate that. But the parts of the cymbal I play more, like crashing on it and just riding it, everything is really close to me. I can just do it right from the side. You can see it behind me here. It's a beautiful cymbal. I don't have to reach very hard, which is pretty cool. Which is part of the idea. The crash cymbals, frequency is the thing again. And this comes back to the 80-20 rule. Which crash cymbals are you striking the most often? Like a lot of the time, like you have crash cymbals that are accent crashes or riding crashes. And so if you're coming to like the kind of 16 and 18, the one over your hi-hat's probably most of the time more for just accenting. Not too many people are crashing on that one. The one on the right ends up being more for crashing. So the one on the right, in my opinion, shouldn't be that far away from the ride cymbal. Like you got the ride cymbal, I think it should be somewhere where you just move your hand over and you can ride on the crash cymbal pretty easily with that externally rotated thing. Same thing though, the angles matter. You want to make sure you're striking it at a 45-degree angle and you're not reaching too far away because that turns into a lot of extra work.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it's kind of, if you give yourself the time, you go set up your drum set, you do these tips and tricks and just experiment with it and forget what your drum set looked like yesterday, kind of modify and just move forward, experiment, try it this way. It didn't really feel great. Okay, try something else. I think it could be a lot of fun for people to experiment. And again, very beneficial if you are actually currently in pain when you're playing. Because, I mean, you're not supposed to be in pain while playing the drums. That's not something that should be happening. So there's fixes with your heights and angles. And I think a great way, as we kind of wrap up, because I think we just probably hit an hour and that's perfect timing for this, is to check out drummechanics.com and see Brandon's course there. And I'll have a link in the description for it so people can check it out here. And then what your social media, it's all the same name and everything like that.
Yep, just check out Drum Mechanics on Instagram and Facebook. I think YouTube is Brandon Drum Mechanics. If you just search Drum Mechanics on YouTube, you'll find me. I got a bunch of great stuff up there. But what I would say is if you go to the website, if anyone is listening, like the challenge with doing any of these podcasts and doing this kind of deep dive is we're talking top layer about so much stuff. If anyone wants to learn more, right, I have the full course on it. I'd love for you to check it out and invest into it. But honestly, if you're not sure, there is a free, shorter introductory ergonomics course that goes through kick, snare, hats, and we get into all these principles. It's a 20-minute crash course where we go through these and you can see them in real time, the concepts. I'd encourage you to do that. Just go to the website. You can literally put your email in. It's the first email that comes. You'll get it within minutes and you can get working on this right away. And if you don't want to invest in any of the programs we're doing, you could get started and make some great changes because truthfully, I wish I could get there are great testimonials on the website from people that I've worked with, and you can see some pros who say some really great things. But there's a bunch who don't say things, that don't want to talk about it because they're fearful of losing gigs, because if people find out they're hurting and they're struggling, they might not get the next tour. So there's a lot more of those. And so everything I'm trying to put out there is just to make sure that people don't get hurt, because my business is dealing with people who are at the end of the road, who've had so much bodily damage from their life because they just didn't know certain things and they put their body through a lot. And professional hockey players to executives to gardeners, like the extremes. We're all young enough and strong enough now that these changes I'm talking to you about, you learn these small principles and it can absolutely extend your career. And even if you're struggling, can get you to the place where you're playing pain-free, which is what many of the people I'm working with right now are doing. And I love it. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have known Brandon for a while, since we've done our first episode, and we talk on Instagram and chat here and there and stuff. And I can tell you, everyone listening, very much that he truly does, again, from his business, he does care about making people feel better. It's not some, I want to get into this and, like I don't want to say a gimmick of like, I don't know, trying to sell this course just to make money. It's like, truly, I do think you care about making people feel better. Like, I completely get that vibe from you, which I know is the case. So again, I recommend everyone check it out. DRUMMechanics.com, and then link in the description, his socials. You post some really great stuff on your social media as well. So even just following you there, you can learn a lot and then apply these principles to your playing as well. So before we wrap up, I want to thank everyone for listening. Thanks to T Drums, Tim Funk on Patreon. If you want to support the show, patreon.com/drum history podcast. Brandon is the first guest up in my, current new attic 3rd floor setup after the renovation is more or less done. So I'm going to add more cool stuff behind me if you're on YouTube and build it out more. But
more drums, man. We need more drums up there.
I know there's going to be more drums. I'm splitting it with my wife, who works here like from home like 3 days a week, and having a big mic and stuff. We're figuring it out. I now have my lights like attached to the desk, so there's no stands, and I've got a teleprompter and camera. So she's putting up with it. But anyway, so Brandon, thank you, my friend, for being here. It's great to have you back on. We'll do it again with more ergonomic stuff down the road. It's just always a pleasure to have you on here.
Thanks so much. But honestly, I got some fitness stuff that's coming up, so I think people might be keen on that too. It should be pretty cool.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Brandon.
All right. Thanks for having me. A pleasure.